For those of you that weren't with us last time, we're in the midst of a presentation about Athens. So we've kind of gone through some of the big scope of history of Greece in general, and where it is, and some of that history, because now we're going to narrow down, because what we started to do is we started to really look at some ancient, even more ancient, it's all this scale. So when we first started, we looked at some of the geography, and then we jumped into like the island of Knossos and the ancient Minoan civilization. And then we were looking at a few other things like the Mount Olympus and some of the Delphi, the Oracle of Delphi, some of these things, because in time, those are some of the oldest back. So now we moved, and the last time when we met, it was the week before Easter, we were in Athens, but we focused on sort of ancient Athens and the Acropolis and some of those things, that sort of era. So we're still in Athens, but we're kind of moving forwards in time, but it's going to overlap a little bit, because it's, when we look at it, it's not just what was happening in like the time of Paul, but up until then. So Athens is so critical to understand both what was happening back then and then moving forwards into our time, because it also impacts understanding what's happening there now. It's just kind of interesting from a different point of view. This sort of centralized cross point of so many civilizations. So a few things to hit as part of this conversation. One of the first is just looking at modern Athens and comparing that. So the modern Athens, the city of Athens, is only 15 square miles. City, remember, it's kind of like, if you're familiar, my best example, because I know it best, is Atlanta. The city of Atlanta is this tiny little spot that only has a population of like 350,000, which is still big. But, okay, Atlanta is then a metro area, stretches for about 100 miles, end to end. Well, the city of modern Athens is 15. The greater metro Athens area, if you spread the whole thing, this is all just where it's all mushed. 1,131 square miles is considered the greater metro. Comparison, which is interesting, I'll show you an image of this. Go back to 450 BC. So this was an era when they were in these city-states. We had Athens and Sparta and stuff like that, and they created this thing called the Long Walls. And it was created particularly as a defense against the Spartans and some others. And the idea that they could do with these long walls was that you could move everybody inside the walls and defend it, and it would take you from the Acropolis to the port area of Piraeus, and have these long walls, and everybody could fit inside, and effectively they had a wonderful defense because they had the water all the way through, and so you couldn't, and they always had a good navy for that. So effectively you couldn't like siege them out and starve them out, you'd have to get over the walls. Just interesting. But that we'll show as an image. So this is the long walls of Athens. So roughly 450 BC, it's about 4 miles from the Acropolis. So this is obviously a recreation. 4 miles from the Acropolis out to that port area of Piraeus. And this is a representation. We don't know for sure, but basically the things that we have some understanding about, this would have been the greater Athens kind of community about 450 BC. Now in terms of cities, it's still huge in terms of cities. That's a lot of housing. And then you had agricultural stuff and they could move it in. But that gives you a little sense of what it might have been like, as best as we can estimate it, at that era. That is Athens. That's just one element. Gives you roughly the same angle. Roughly. So what you've got here, the Acropolis is about here. Yeah, not all these. This is other little hilly things. This is the Acropolis. Piraeus is out here. You can kind of see the port area. So that long walls would have kind of gone like this. The rest of this is modern Athens. You can see it goes out to the Ceramic Gulf, goes over here. Corinth and stuff is out that way. If you move around where some of those things are at, this is not water. That's sort of hill land. It's not covered by anything. This area right here is sort of hill land. The more modern, larger port is that way. So that's roughly southish. This is northish. It's reverse direction for that purpose. Different view. You can see in the yellow, that is where the Acropolis is at. You can see Piraeus, that's the modern port. And then you can kind of see, even the texture of the land is interesting because you can kind of see the density of all the housing and things, and then it rolls up into those foothills, and those are not developed yet. And if you keep going, you can see the Strait of Salamis, that goes west, and then Corinth is that direction. But it kind of gives a sense of that density. A little bit of population information. 4 million in the greater metro area, roughly commensurate with Atlanta, give or take a bit. Notice how the population changes over time. The 500 era, BC, 150,000 citizens, 100,000 slaves. Slaves, again, was a different context of understanding than what we had. It's a different kind of slavery than we had during the slavery era in the United States, but still slavery. A little bit more financial oriented for various reasons. There are ways to get out of it. It still gives you an idea. 50 AD, the city was much smaller. A lot of things that had happened, but the metro area was still huge. So sort of spread in a different way. By 1520, look what had happened. It had been crushed. There's so many different invasions and different groups that had come through, and there's just a long list when we look at that history of things and people that had come through. But the Ottomans actually did a census, so that's an interesting standing point. 7,000 to 10,000 people. 300 years later, the Ottomans were still in charge. Another census, 1824, only about 9,000 people in Athens. It was effectively an abandoned, that's the size of sort of a large village, practically a large town. 1833, right after the War of Independence that we get to, it's down to 4,000 people. 1907, so about 80 years later, it had astronomically grown. 80 years, you went from 4,000 to 167,000. 20 years later, 700,000. 30 years later, 1,000,001, and only 10 years between 1950 and 1960, 3 million. Now, if you look on your little timeline, I do want to hit this. This is that ancient Athens one. So there's a few things on it, and I tried, this is long, I don't want to go through all of it, some of this is referenced, but what I did try to do is pick out, and you'll see it highlighted as some of the names and famous peoples, but you can see it starts at about, in this Athens area, about 1100 BC, and the Areopagus, the thing that we eventually hear about Paul visiting. We hear that he goes to the Areopagus. Well, that was named for that hill in Athens where they meet. Its council, which nobles kept power in their own hands, so it was sort of a political base. You had a whole bunch of small freeholding peasants. They got increasingly into debt. They were compelled to pay a sixth of all their produce to a creditor. So you think about a tax, 16% tax of everything in your, and you didn't get a whole lot of services to that. It's not an area you argue about, okay, who's building the roads and stuff for the most part. This is, it's a different kind of era. Importantly, there was a guy named Solon. He was elected archon, that's sort of the administrative head. Canceled the debts of the peasants in all of Attica. Attica is the region, the greater region. Athens is the capital of the Attica region today. Made it illegal to enslave a debtor. He was really a champion. Now, there's reasons for it. Some would say he was sort of a beneficial tyrant, but he really did look out, and he had a longer term sort of economic and everything else. If you just keep oppressing everybody, nobody really grows and thrives. Even the whole issue of oligarchs eventually, if you just keep pushing everybody down and say, well, at some point they don't have the money to even buy the stuff that you want to sell. It's self-defeating. So he made every Athenian citizen a member of the ecclesia. This was the folks who could vote for the election of archons. the first cornerstone of their democracy. You got some other people, seized power, different guy, benevolent dictator, Thespis, 543. This is all in Athens, that's why this is all part of it, that's kind of neat. Considered the first actor, he wins the drama competition in Athens, and when you saw, like last time, we kind of showed some of like the theaters, the ancient theaters, and where some of these folks were at. So he would have been part of that. The Athenian ruler, Hippus, toppled by the nobles Vatica with the help of Sparta. So now we start to see in this era is where we start to see the city-state competitions between Sparta and Athens and Thebes and places like that. Get some other people going and everything. Now, which is kind of neat here, is 508. Another guy, Cleisthenes. Program of political reforms. He gives every Athenian citizen a voice in the demos, the local council. Democracy is getting pushed further and getting more opportunity to be representative of what's going to happen. You have the Greek cities rebel against the Persians. This is not quite the era of Alexander the Great, but it was, remember, the Persian Empire preceded Alexander the Great, so that you can see what's starting to happen. Pericles, if you've ever heard of that. He's important. He was born in Attica, son of distinguished parents, great nephew of Cleisthenes. Just hold that because he's going to come up when we start talking about the Acropolis and the Parthenon and all those kind of places. Darius, famous guy in the Bible. Darius sends a fleet across the Aegean. He has a huge army of infantry, cavalry. He's going to attack Athens. The Persian fleet secures the island of Elba. Then they want to come across to Marathon. We talked a little bit about that. We had that when we talked about it. The Greeks await there. Philippi, he's the guy that ran. The Athenian hoplites and others, they win this spectacular victory. The Persians get back to their ships, and they sail south towards Athens. But then they decide that they've already had a lot of losses. They're not going to attack it, and they go back out. You get a break. That was 490. 481, 9 years later, Xerxes the First, he's going to come, and he's going to follow up and invade Athens. What was Dad doing? I'm going to finish it. 480, the famous Thermopylae. So Marathon was not the same. Thermopylae is a different place. So Thermopylae, that's where they landed. Leonidas, he's the one that defended that. They didn't defeat the Persians, but they slowed them down enough that everybody else could get to Athens. And then eventually they retreat and go home again. Part of that was the Athenian fleet. So here the navy came into play. They managed to bottle up the Persians, defeat the fleet. 478, 462, Pericles. Pericles introduces full democracy for all the Athenian citizens, enabling them to vote and participate in the administration of the state. Sparta, more stuff going on with Sparta. They get in offense, they get mad at each other, they start having city-states and opposes and start getting people going, and then you have the Peloponnese Wars. Big famous things. This is the Peloponnese Peninsula. When we were looking at that, is the area where Corinth is at. So that area, I have to show it to you in a minute, but when you get down from Athens and go west, Corinth is here. It's on this peninsula, and that is the Peloponnese Peninsula. Sparta's in the middle of that. So now you have this fighting, and places like Corinth is in between them. Yeah, and you have kings coming. Pericles, eventually, they got stuff 443. He's selected by the assembly as the leading general, in a post to which he was reappointed every year until his death. He was good. They liked him. And under Pericles, the colonies and garrisons are established in all these strategic areas. He builds a trading network, does a whole bunch of things, very effective. Socrates, 423, one of the great philosophers. 433, Pericles breaches his own treaty. Gets you in trouble. Get a treaty with Sparta. Sends 30 triremes supporting a different city. That gets everybody fighting again. Sudden attack on another ally of Athens, 431. The Second Peloponnesian War. The Athenians capture Melos, kill all the males of the island. Sell all the women and children into slavery. During some of this, Pericles is also the guy who built and designed much of the Acropolis and the Parthenon and those buildings atop. So he was not just a general, but he was really influential in the construction and the design of some of those places. And then you can start to see again, Socrates is convicted, we have that, you have Plato, you have Aristotle, Philip of Macedon, now we get the transition to the era of Alexander the Great, Roman General Sulla, 86, Nero comes in 66 AD, so this is when the Romans have come in, and we see that, they finally come into play. It was 86 BCE, the Romans besiege Athens, they win. And then 529, Justinian closed the famous pagan philosophy school of Athens. Justinian was a Christian emperor. So this is 520, so this is by the time. But the reason that's important is you still had the philosophy school of Athens, which had been founded by Socrates. And Aristotle and Plato and all those folks were part of that. That still, there's a whole element though, of those were sort of holding on to some of those ancient Greek, and you had some of the ancient Greek gods and religious elements, and Justinian is the one that said we're done with that. Because it's not just philosophy, it's the ancient gods and things. That Peloponnesian War, we mentioned it, 431 to 404. You can read there, a bunch of things happen, treaties and fights and everything else. And that takes us a little bit of an overview of Athens. I think you have on your sheet separately the Acropolis of Athens timeline. So we went through that previously just for the Acropolis itself, but you can see 447 was Pericles began the reconstruction of the Acropolis. There was 8 stuff up there earlier, but he really did it and did the Temple of Athena and the Temple of Athena Nike and all these other kind of things. So a lot of things in there. What we can look at a little bit differently then is the 1820s and the modern history, because we stopped there. Let's see. So, important dates, 1821, Greek War of Independence from the Ottomans. You have a whole bunch of occupations, British and French, 1862, 1871, all these kind of things. 1896, Athens hosts the first of the modern Olympic Games. You have a Greek-Turkish war, the Greek lost land, Macedonian struggle, Greeks and Bulgarians and Turks, people fighting. 1912, Macedonia North and Epirus West become part of the Greek country at that point. 1913, Crete becomes part of Greece. 1940 to 44, the Greek-Italian War, Axis occupation. So the Germans came in, they occupied everything, they occupied the islands, a lot of trouble, a lot of issues, eventually a lot of fighting, and some of the islands and things like this, the bombs, World War II, a lot of damage. Greek Civil War, this is huge. So in 1946, after finally the Germans are pushed out, you had sort of a communist versus democratic ideologies. You had an internal civil war. Huge displacement of people. You notice when we mentioned how some of those huge population numbers changed? In the middle of the war, what do people do? Everything starts to go, they end up, generally speaking, they migrate to the cities. You're hoping there's some protection there, you're not sitting by yourself out on your farm somewhere. Where can you get food? Where can you feel safer? So they migrate to the cities, but that puts huge stress on the cities. So you had overcrowding, unemployment, all these things. Cheap building programs, we see that when we see some of those, just the density of the city and how it was created in a really short time frame. A lot of struggle. That moved with some of those internal issues, struggling with unemployment, with lack of infrastructure, with lack of industry, trying to rebuild that. You get political turmoil. Who's in charge, who should be in charge, who thinks they can do it better, and you get outside players. So notice the 1967 and 1974, what's known as the Colonel's regime, the junta. So you had a military group decided to take over. They were sponsored, and this became very interesting with our guide. Our guide was not shy to say, this was one of the black marks in the history of Greece, modern Greece, what the junta did, how they treated people, how they made people disappear, everything else, and who sponsored them? The United States. because the United States was afraid that they would otherwise get a socialist communist government of some kind. So again, they sponsored anyone who would be strong enough to keep the communists out and did not care what they did. She was very, very clear, and she lived through some of that herself. What's interesting there is the junta fell in 1974, but if you notice that little note of how that happened, the Greek junta government decided to assassinate Archbishop Makarios, the leader of Cyprus, so that they could unite the mixed Turkish-Greek island and pull it under Greek rule, because it was a mixed island. They just decided to go in and assassinate the Archbishop. Led to a Turkish invasion days later, and they occupied northern Cyprus. Well, once everybody figured out what had happened, and this thing all blew up, and they didn't get the island, and they figured out what had happened to the assassination, the rest of the country then kind of did do this upswelling. The junta collapsed the next week. A new guy, Konstantinos Karamanlis, former prime minister, came back to power, that he did organize parliamentary elections, referendum. It became somewhat of a socialist leaning, but not communist. Now that raises issues later on, is politics and funding and way too many people employed by the government. You know, so you give jobs to people and we're going to take care of you, but you don't have the taxes, you don't have the development, you have everything else that unravels. But the monarchy was out, Greece becomes a member of the European community, and then in the 1990s, 2000s, you guys are old enough, you might remember a lot of struggles, things with the World Bank, finally being told we're not going to give you any more loans just to go further into debt. You have to restructure your economy, you have to get people off the public, you've got to privatize industries, you've got to do some of these things because it is not sustainable. And they've been pulling out of that, which is good. But a lot of challenges. They've also had recently all these refugees from places like Syria. They are so close to all these other ones. It's not that far to go from Tunisia and to go from parts of Libya and to go from parts of Egypt and stuff like this. So Greek is an easy place to land. It's still dangerous, but in relative terms, it's one of the easiest places to get to. And if you can take the land route, curling through Turkey and stuff like this, whether Turkey wants you to or not, the point is if you can get to Greece, that's your entry to the rest of the European Union. Which, of course, the Greeks are like, we don't have the resources to handle all these immigrants. So huge issues that come with that. But a lot of improvements. This I thought was neat. We did hear about this. Recent encouragements for residents to return and rebuild. They're trying to get them back out of the cities. So, this last little bit. They now have a program. If you are willing to move out to the country areas, you will get land, you'll get some assistance, grants, tax breaks, and you get to own a piece of property out in the mountains and the hills and some of these other towns and stuff like this. The new owner must renovate the property and operate it as a hotel or B&B for 15 years, and then they can choose. They can run it as a hotel or convert it to a family home, and the debts are paid. But the whole point is, it's like an investment. Yes, we recognize we're giving land, we're helping you do, but it's also getting people out of the cities. It's developing economically in some areas that are outside. So that takes you a bit of information. But now let's look at some pictures. So this is modern. This is Getty Images, but it's a nice image of the Acropolis looking out again towards the Piraeus, so you can see that same angle. You can see how this thing is just a platform. It's about 500 feet from the base, the very land base, up to the highest land area. That is representative of the density. Now you saw it from way up. Almost everything is 3 to 5, and in some cases 7 stories. I was curious. I didn't look for it. I got too busy on something earlier thinking, what is the population density of Athens? Now it's still a lot less than places like Hong Kong, but still, I mean, that is just phenomenal. It's just skinny little street, and you can see it's just like when we had to build, bing, 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 just make lines, make buildings, make lines, make buildings.
I don't know how to get enough food here. You know, to feed that many people.
The amount that you have to bring in. It goes back to when we were talking about Rome and some of these other ones. You know, the whole story of Rome, when the Roman Empire, how much of the administration, Rome was effectively, immensely effective at its administrative state to keep food flowing into Rome. What they said is you have to feed them and you have to entertain them. So you had eventually one of those, you know, some of those Roman Caesars where you get the food, and where do you get the food? You get it from Egypt. That was the breadbasket. You had the Nile area, you had massive amounts of wheat and corns and things like this that they could get. So you were bringing in massive amounts of food. Again, somewhat dangerous, but it was the shortest route was to get it straight over the Mediterranean. But the whole point was you have to feed them. Otherwise, you will have an uprising. That is the modern port of Piraeus. Now, if you look at the size of that cruise ship, it's kind of a big port, but kind of not. I mean, but remember, it goes back 2,500 years. They haven't added to the port much because it's where's the water at and where's the land. But it's very, very modern, but there's a much, much bigger port further to the east and south along the coast more of the Aegean. So if you're really looking to do the bigger ships and lots of things, that's where you go. So they have stuff here, but this one is right there at Athens. That's a view looking westward. This is towards Corinth and things, and that's from the top of the Acropolis area. That's a video. You get the sense of the height of the Acropolis, and yeah, you have those mountains in the background, but it is, that's looking more eastward. That is the Ceramic Gulf. That way was trying, and then it was curling, and that's slightly northwestish. That little mountain is just slightly higher than the Acropolis mountain. This is just from the bus. And no, you cannot see the Acropolis from there, but it just gives you the scale of the city. Now this is neat. What do you see in this picture? Rent a car in English. RT Tours. And then the cute, sort of Greeky, funny looking excursions in English, but almost a mixing of font and style. And then the street signs. Okay. So you have, in much of Greece, you've got these dual street signs. And you've got a whole bunch of things, which is all of these. That's another one. It was kind of like, wow, on one side, the dance club. And then you have Greek and you have English and you can have, much of the things are in Greek and English, but you'll also see French, you'll see other things like that because they're so close to these other countries. But a lot of it's in both English and Greek. So in a way, it is very amenable to an English-speaking person just to be able to wander, because you can actually read so many things, even if you don't know Greek. But you can also learn it to learn Greek. Because you can look at the street sign and say, what's that? Yeah, that's what that is. That's neat. This is a little roadside. These are all over the place. As you're driving down, usually major highways, you'll just see these. There's another one there and another one here. Those typically are small little family-created shrines for someone who passed away, typically from a traffic accident. Which is scary to think of how many of those there are, but you also realize in some cases some of those have been there for 100 years and they just keep going up and nobody tears them down. But they're all an amazing, creative, little tiny shrine things. This is really, really common. You know what it is? Water. Solar water heater. It is so sunny and so warm, you put those things up, you don't have to pay money. You pay the installation, but you're not paying to heat your water. Here you have the Presidential Guard. So the building that they were coming out of is right here, so these guys were marching by. So this is the classic ones that we kind of see sometimes in little videos and things like this. So this is your guard. things that go with this. Let's see. Pull this out. I always wondered, I don't know about you, I've seen those before. Why do they have pom-poms on their shoes? Okay, the taroukia. These are the shoes worn by the Greek presidential guards. They are 4.4 pounds each. This is like those ankle weights that you wear, right?
Mm-hmm.
Look at the bottom of them. They have nails. See the pom-poms? You notice that there's something curled up on the front of the pom-pom? Buried under the pom-pom is a pointed knife. Kick! You can kick somebody. They are considered a national symbol of freedom, courage, and the sound of battle. When they march on any kind of a rocky surface, you hear that. So we're not going to have no.
They got strong thighs.
You can't carry around those 4-pound boots. You also go back and put your tennis shoes on. It's like, oh, that's nice. This is looking out into that scrubland. So what's interesting here is just understanding once you get out of the city, the natural area through here is it's sort of rocky. The soil is reasonably thin in a lot of these areas, and you can see what you don't have is massive forest. It's sort of scrub. Now I hear, having looked at a little bit of this, historically, at one time, even this area was rather heavily forested. But 3,000 years of local civilization, go and get another tree. We either want to burn it or we want to build something with it. And you just keep going out further. And you know what? You didn't have until any kind of a modern era the idea that maybe we should be planting more trees. No, that's just go get another one. So they effectively denoted everything. Now, exactly where you will see as we get further north, there's much more foresting north. But at one time, you can hear accounts of the wonderful trees that were in the area. They're all gone. Now, how far did they go and how much up the mountains? But if you just took them down and eventually it's gone. Can you ever rebuild it? That is Athens. So I will pause. Our next one is going to be Philippi and Lydia and Ephesus. But before we hit that, questions, thoughts on Athens, either ancient or more modern? Anything I can try to answer or that you're curious or just want to chat about?
We were fortunate enough to see the Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee. They have a full,
it's a smaller
full-scale replica.
Is it full scale? I know that they have it. I didn't know if it was full scale or not.
Yes.
They said it was full scale.
Okay, could be.
It's big.
Yeah.
But it's in a park, Centennial Park.
Mm-hmm.
I had thought when I went to Daisy School, I was a broke student, I couldn't go in. So we went back and we went in. And inside of it, they have a statue of Athena, Athena, the warrior god.
Yep.
And I mean, it's like, you go, wow. She's 30-something feet tall. She's got her hand out and got a statue of Nike, the winged warrior, with the wings and everything in her hand.
Full size.
She's 7 foot tall, and she's about like this, thing. And it's all painted up in the colors and everything that's through research and all that's come up with and did it. But I thought that was really neat.
You mentioned the colors. So often when we think of archaeology, we see all these things that are stone and kind of plain. And it's hard to remember that that's nature is weathering and dyes and just, we can put signs out and how fast those will fade.
Yep.
But to go in some of these places, when we talked about the tomb for Alexander the Great, things like that, and because it was buried, and then they could see the pigments and the different kinds of pigments, they hadn't degraded, you realize how beautiful. And whether it was Egyptian, whether it was Roman or Greek, I mean, they painted it was great. You didn't have these plain, sandy, drab colored. I mean, they were gorgeous. Yeah.
Yeah, the pyramids were but you couldn't see the stones. They were smooth and bright white. As if you could see them from long distances off. So they did it on purpose to show the rest of the world, this is what we can do.
Why is that saying no signal? That's weird. Okay.
But if you're ever in Nashville, Tennessee, passing through, stop in to see that. That's
Okay.
what, you'll be glad you went and saw it. It's,
Been one time, it's about pass.
yeah.
Way along.
Yeah.
I lived for a year
Yeah.
and I went to school. I didn't go back for 30 years,
At least.
about 30 years. We went back and we drove to the tourist, where they give you coupons and tell you where to go and all like that. And I'm standing there downtown Nashville and I'm like, I don't know what nothing is.
2 years on it.
I forgot everything. And I was standing there and I looked over, there's the Ryman Auditorium. And I've never had an experience like it before.
It looked funny.
It was like a flood of stuff hitting my brain all at one time. I said, I know where we're at. Go down that road, go over there.
But you had to get the landmark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you
when I
realize how much has
saw the Ryman
changed.
Auditorium, it all came back.
Because the river stops the roads. You have,
Just
it's crazy.
probably not 4 miles from the Ryman Auditorium and the Chevrolet dealership. It's still there. It's a different
What
road.
was there?
When Kim and I were,
Ken, where'd you go to school?
Nashville Auto Diesel School,
I know these.
trade school.
when Kim and I were dating, we went to Key Island. Towards the tail end of that, right before we got engaged and stuff. And it was just a couple of years ago that we went back, for 30 some years later.
Yeah.
And she's like, I don't remember this. Is Kim. The whole time we were preparing, we could maybe go back to just beware, it's been 30 years.
Yeah. We did
30
that.
years, and she's back. She's like, "This is a lot more developed." We could when we were here the last time. That was 30 years ago. I mean, you had a little spot, and then everything else was open. It's like, no, it's all developed now. You got all the condos and big things, and
Where's the crab shack?
yeah. What would Paul think? That's a good transition point. What would Paul think?
Where am I?
Philippi. So Philippi, very far north. So again, you've got the sort of the tilted L. Philippi is in the north. It's a Macedonian region, so kind of like we've got states from the Macedonian region. You'll notice right next to it, kind of cut by the little yellow, red line, is Lydia. So Lydia is a person, but it's also sort of it's a little bit of a place. It's not a city. We'll get to that. But it's known for that because of the shrine at Lydia, the baptismal type of place that is there, but it's just literally down the hill from ancient Philippi. So there's modern and ancient. So that gives you an idea of where we're talking. So the history of Philippi, named after Philip. Little bitty settlement there. He expanded it and renamed it after himself, about 350. 169 BC, so 200 years later, the Romans conquered the area, 42. This is where your little other history, if you're familiar with classic history. Octavian and Mark Antony were chasing Julius Caesar's killers, Brutus and Gaius. So you actually had a split, and they had armies and stuff like this. This was all part of what happened with that. This is where Philippi area is where these two armies finally clashed. They've been chasing and this and that and the other. And Octavian and Mark Antony defeated Brutus and Gaius. So that established Octavian and Mark Antony as them in charge. But you'll notice, 11 years later, Octavian defeats Antony and Cleopatra because politics is politics, and who wants to be in charge, and I think I should be the emperor versus you should be the emperor, and all those things. So Antony and Cleopatra is where they were defeated. Now, they didn't die there, but their armies were done, and then they kind of ran, and they went back to Egypt and all these other kind of things. By 50 AD, Philippi was a major city as a Roman city, trading hub on the Via Egnatia. This was this emperor's national road. So as you saw, right along the coast there, so coming out of Rome, you would have come up if you were doing travel, you would have come across, you would have come across, you would have come through Philippi, then you would have come either down into Turkey and around, because that'll come back up when we get to Ephesus. It's also on the Via Egnatia, just that same path, which is why when we see where did Paul go, you're following things like the Roman road when you can. That's just nature, and that's where the big towns are at. Prosperous through the 600s. So for a long time, you're roughly 1,000 years of a major city, and then it just became a long decline and effectively abandoned by the 1540s. Now there was a traveling guy that wrote, there was a Frenchman that was traveling in the 1540s, and his writing, this is when I was grabbing it from a random source, but he was writing, and his comment about coming right through that Philippi is he's nothing but ruins. But what happens over the space of 900 years? You have empires rise and fall. This is a good little point. When we start thinking of Philippi, it's really then the question, we're moving into, because of all these conversations, it's going to be more biblical oriented. So we've kind of given background to some of this. There's not a lot of references in the Bible, in the Old Testament, other than potentially a few references in Daniel. Some people look at some of the prophetic elements of Daniel referring to the Greek Empire. Either, depending on how you understand Daniel, if it was written longer back, prophetic, or if it was written more contemporary. There's different arguments about when Daniel was actually written. I'm not going to get into it, but that's really not much in the Old Testament because it's mostly the Greek Empire. I think the Old Testament, generally speaking, finishes about 400, 500 BC. Well, the Greek Empire is the 300s and moving. You had Greeks, but you didn't have the Greek Empire. So the last Old Testament contact written was understood to be the book of Malachi, written about 450. And that didn't really talk about it. 200 years later, the Greek Empire arose when Philip of Macedon was assassinated in 336. Now, we talked about that when we were talking about King Philip's tomb. Things of that nature. His son, Alexander the Great, became the king emperor of Macedon at 20. Immediately created and expanded the Greek Empire. So he's the one that then went, and when we went through that, looked at the maps and everything that goes with it. Conquered the Persian Empire. He led the armies to victory all the way across Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt. He was all the way around that corner of them, and he went as far east as India. It's huge. He became the overlord of Asia Minor, Pharaoh of Egypt, became the great king of Persia at the age of 25. Now, he did all this in a short period of time, but he was constantly on the move. He was amazingly effective as a general. A bunch of other things might have lined up, but he was phenomenally effective at that. Over 8 years, his capacity as king, commander, politician, everything else, he led that army on 11,000 miles of conquest. Founded over 70 cities, stretched over 3 continents, and covered 2 million square miles. This was the Greek Empire. One of the first true, when we look at the scale, even these Persians, you realize Alexander the Great just covered so much more ground. Covered Greece in the west, north to the Danube, south as far as Egypt we mentioned, all the way to the Indian Punjab. The Greek language became the common tongue. Now, he also had a massively effective administrative state. What we start to see with the empires that succeed, like the Mongols just went and conquered. Well, but they never stayed anywhere. That wasn't the point. They were nomadic people. They kind of went, and they just kind of went and pulled and went. They didn't care. Alexander did. So he was building an empire. But to do that, you had to have common language. You had to be able to communicate with everybody. You had to build these roads. So he was kind of like how the Romans did, so they learned a lot from Alexander. But Alexander had this massive administrative state, but to do that, he also spread the culture. So as he's founding these cities and roads and putting these administrators in place and saying everybody's going to have the same language, they can all do Greek, the effectiveness of that was that everybody started to learn. And even after he was gone, the practicality of speaking Greek. So if you were a trader, you'll learn Greek. If you're a politician, you'll learn Greek. The effectiveness, almost like what we see today, generally speaking, with English and Spanish. You got those two, you can go most places. At least get by. Alexander the Great died in 323, split the kingdom into 4 parts. Again, we've had some conversation about that. So we have 4 different parts, but this is where it comes into play for the Bible, because 2 of them were tiny little things off to one side, reasonably, sort of parts of Greek and then a couple of older skitters. But the 2 big ones were the Seleucids in the area of Syria and the Ptolemies in Egypt. Those came into play in the intertestamental period with the Maccabee rebellion against the Seleucids. That was the Seleucid king who said, I am the greatest, I'm God incarnate, and they're rebelling against that. Eventually those collapsed, they had internal fighting, and the Romans came in and they took over in general. So the Romans then conquered what had been the Greek Empire. So by the time of Jesus and Paul, the Greek Empire had been gone 300 years, but the traditions, and not just the traditions of language, a lot of the traditions of philosophy were still there. Some of the communications, some of the Romans idolized, and this will come up when we start looking at archaeology, the Romans idolized the Greeks. You actually had a Greek revival. You hear about Greek revival in the United States?
Yeah.
Well, you had one there. So you had the Roman Empire was just fascinated with the architecture and the majesty of the high Greek element. So 300 years after the Greeks, the Romans were doing Greeky things. So this covered a lot of ground. It also covered everything from some issues of religion. So you had the Romans had a lot of the same gods as the Greeks, but they called them different names. See all those kind of things come by? So when Paul took his travels to Philippi and Athens and Ephesus and places like that, each one of those, he's going to these Roman cities that have massive Greek influence on them. And many of them are part of now modern day Greek and Turkey. So Philippi. We've kind of hit that. Let's see what it does from Philippi in the Bible. It's the first European church founded by Paul. So he was traveling. So if you take a look, and I didn't get one of his maps, but we had one earlier. When he comes, that's one of the first places he gets to. He establishes a church in Philippi. It notably had it appears, people argue about it, but a very small Jewish community. One of the reasons is it's interesting little word things that we don't recognize. It talks about going to the Jewish community place of prayer. And the scholars that really study this, they said, that's an important phrase, because he didn't say he went to the synagogue. Traditionally, if you would have had, dozens to hundreds, you would have had a synagogue. Philippi does not appear to have had a Jewish population large enough to support a synagogue. Doesn't mean they weren't there, but they just had their own sort of like a house church. Now, and then when he was there, he met with women by the river, and the whole story of Lydia. We'll get to that more when we get to Lydia herself. And it's the site of Paul exorcising the demon, if you remember that whole story. It's the girl that was sort of insightful prophesying. She was the money source for a couple guys, and when he kicks the demon out of her, they're mad because, effectively he took away their livelihood, and so they run him out of town. But they try to run him out of town, they get arrested, and all that, they go into prison. So it's him and Silas, and this is the location where you have the prison, where the earthquake occurs, and they don't leave, and they have a whole conversation with the guard, say, we're still here, don't kill yourself, and then he becomes a convert. Paul's letter. So the letter to the Philippians is after his visit. So if you think about it, he didn't write the letter first. He visited with them, he founded the church, then he's traveling, and eventually later on, things are established, and he's writing back to them, because they know him. And he was there. So it's encouraging them to imitate Jesus, encourages them to live out Jesus' examples of humility, obedience, joy in the suffering. There's persecution in that era when Paul was doing some of this. How do you find joy in the midst of persecution? Serving others. Brothers and Christians, brothers and sisters living in humility, and don't give in to fear. So that is the introduction to Philippi. This is part of the ruins of ancient Philippi. So what we have here, now Philippi itself was larger. This is just a piece of that ancient city of Philippi. You can see, and we'll get to, there's a whole huge cathedral that was under construction at one point. This is much later. It wasn't the Paul era. This is, where was that at? I'm trying to remember what the era of that was. I'll have to figure out where that's at. But anyways, they had, that was being built, and they tried to do a great big dome. Oh, here it is. 3rd century basilica, 15th century. This one. It was never finished. They had a domed roof design, and it was not adequate, and it collapsed. They didn't have the architectural design to be able to do this great big dome, and that's the one that's in that corner. This is the entrance to the 1st century basilica. So this is probably where eventually Paul would have been, but not the first piece of it, because when he first came, you didn't have a basilica there. You didn't have a Christian presence. But by the end of the 1st century, you started to have a basilica there. So how things changed over the space of about 50 years. But this is the entrance to that. This is the location where people are trying to go in. This is understood to be the prison where Paul and Silas were actually placed. There's actually an entry point, and you can go in, and it's kind of closed off for security reasons and things, but you can go in and see. This is where they were placed, and then the basilica, when it was built over the site of where Paul's prison was at. It's kind of an interesting use of that, and retained. That's that 15th century, kind of looking out over ruins of the old city. This is something I've mentioned at one point. It's a great example of it. When you have these great big stone blocks, how do you keep them from shifting? I don't know if you can see. Here, and here. So what would have happened is when they cut the blocks, they would have cut these slots into the blocks. When they put the blocks together, then you would come in with molten iron. You would pour molten iron into that would form fit into that, and it would seal and lock, so that when you had earthquakes or anything else, it didn't shift as much. Now keep this in mind when we get to Ephesus, because there's an interesting thing about these that you'll notice when we get to Ephesus. But that design is common throughout the Roman Empire and others, as to how do we put blocks together and keep them from shifting around. That is the theater at Philippi. Nice aerial view. The scale of that is just absolutely huge. It's interesting to see that much of this area was all buried. Not all of it, but I mean a lot of stuff was buried. Excavations began in 1895. It's the first time. Before that, people didn't really worry about archaeology. You had no systematic archaeology until the late 1800s. People would just see ruins. Well, it's ruins. But they didn't care. The whole scholastic effort to say, what was this? How do we preserve it? How do we understand it? Has really been only going on for a bit over 100 years. And the early eras of that often were almost like Napoleon and others. You'd kind of dig some things up and say, this is cool, let's take it back to France. It was more of a trophy item. As you got into the later 1800s, but especially as you get further into the 1900s, it's kind of like, how do we date it? How do we preserve it? How do we know where it was? How do we record these things? You have these arched buttresses in there. You had two to four floors. So this area here, this is all staging area to support the theater, which is up You can almost see this. This would have been the surface area, so everybody down here could see what was out here. Not out here necessarily. You could do things out here, but you had a stage here. So this thing was huge. You can see the scale of this kind of construction. I don't know if you can see that archway. How big that archway would have been, so that you could go back and through and get in behind the seating. Storage for theater props and everything else. Ancient theater actors were exclusively men. Men portrayed women. Interestingly enough, they often wore 4-inch high heels to make their legs look longer. And these shows here, they had gladiators and animals and everything else. The little gladiator at the gate, carving on one of the columns.
It's beautiful.
And you imagine what that would have looked like when it was originally new and it wasn't 2,000 years of weathering. Those archways and people next to them. That's your theater. That's where we'll stop tonight because it's about 10 after. So next week we will get to Lydia of Thyatira. She's from Thyatira. That's her identity. But we'll talk about the person and what's there now. And again, this was at sort of at the bottom of the hills. You would have been able to look up and see Philippi from the Lydia area and the river, the little creek area that was where that particular biblical account was said to have occurred.